The Montana Territory in February 1881 was no place for the faint of heart, when the wind howled across the frozen plains with the fury of 1,000 demons, and snow fell in blinding sheets that could bury a man in minutes. Survival became a matter of split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Maggie Thompson had learned this harsh truth the hard way, standing at the frosted window of her isolated cabin, watching the worst blizzard in decades tear across the landscape. She had no idea that her simple act of human kindness in the next few hours would set in motion events that would forever change her understanding of courage, honor, and what it truly means to belong somewhere. Outside her door, an elderly Blackfoot man was dying in the snow, his weathered hands clutching a sacred medicine bundle as his strength faded with each labored breath. In 7 days, his tribe would surround her cabin, but not for the reasons she feared. The February wind struck the cabin walls with such violence that Maggie could feel the entire structure shudder beneath its assault. She pressed her face closer to the ice-crusted window, trying to peer through the swirling snow that had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien wasteland. The storm had been raging for 3 days now, and there was no sign of it weakening. Maggie pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved away from the window, adding another split log to the fire. The flames danced higher, casting flickering shadows across the sparse interior of the one-room cabin. She had built this place with her own hands over the past 18 months, every board carefully selected, every nail driven with determination, born of necessity rather than choice. At 28 years old, Maggie Thompson was an anomaly in the Montana Territory, a single woman who had claimed her own homestead, who hunted her own meat and chopped her own firewood, who asked nothing from anyone and expected even less. Her calloused hands and sun-weathered face told the story of countless hours of back-breaking labor, but her steel-gray eyes held an intelligence and determination that had intimidated more than one would-be suitor in the nearby settlement of Cedar Falls. The truth was, Maggie had come to Montana not seeking adventure or fortune, but running from a past that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. Back in Ohio, she had been Margaret Catherine Worthington, the rebellious daughter of a prominent banker who had scandalous opinions about women's rights and an even more scandalous relationship with her father's business partner. When that relationship had ended in betrayal and public humiliation, when whispers followed her down every street in Columbus, she had made a choice that shocked her family and society alike. She had taken her inheritance, changed her name, and disappeared into the western frontier, where a person's past mattered less than their ability to survive another day. For 18 months, she had been Maggie Thompson, homesteader. For 18 months, she had convinced herself that isolation was strength, that needing no one meant no one could hurt her. But 3 days ago, when the blizzard had begun, she had started to question that philosophy. 3 days of being trapped in a cabin barely 12 feet square, with only her own thoughts for company and the growing realization that if something happened to her out here, no one would even know to look for her body until spring. The nearest neighbor was Jacob Morrison, a gruff widower whose ranch lay 8 miles to the southeast. A decent man, but one who respected her desire for solitude and rarely visited unless she made the journey to town for supplies. The settlement of Cedar Falls was 15 miles away, connected by a trail that was treacherous even in good weather. In conditions like these, it might as well have been on the moon. Maggie checked her supplies for the dozenth time that day. Enough salt pork to last another week if she was careful. A sack of beans that would stretch even further. Flour for bread, though she was running low on the precious sourdough starter that made it palatable. Coffee enough for maybe 10 more days, and she had already begun rationing that precious commodity. Water wasn't a concern. She could always melt snow. But firewood was becoming a serious issue. The cord of split logs she had so carefully stacked against the cabin's north wall was diminishing faster than she had anticipated. This storm was unlike anything she had experienced since arriving in Montana. The cold was so intense that the cabin required a constant fire to remain habitable. At this rate, she would run out of wood in 4 days, maybe 5, if she let the fire die down at night and risked waking to a cabin so cold it could kill her. She had considered venturing outside to retrieve more wood from the pile behind the cabin, but the wind was strong enough to knock a person down, and the snow was falling so heavily that visibility extended no more than a few feet. Getting lost between the cabin and the woodpile was not only possible but likely. She had heard stories of homesteaders found frozen to death just yards from their own front doors, disoriented by blizzards that turned familiar surroundings into deadly mazes. Maggie moved to the small table where she kept her journal, a habit she had maintained since childhood. Writing had always helped her think clearly, organize her thoughts when the world seemed chaotic. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and began to record the day's observations. February 14th, 1881. Day 3 of the blizzard. Wind from the northwest. Stronger than yesterday. Snow accumulation is difficult to measure, but likely over 4 feet on the level. Temperature dropping steadily. Firewood situation becoming critical. If the storm continues much longer, we'll need to burn furniture. Note: check the lean-to tomorrow if the wind calms. May be able to reach the emergency wood supply. She paused, pen hovering over the paper. What else was there to write? That she was scared? That the isolation she had once embraced now felt like a trap? That she was beginning to understand why? Most women in the territory didn't attempt to live alone on homesteads. A sudden crash from outside made her drop the pen, ink splattering across the page. Something heavy had struck the cabin wall near the door. Maggie grabbed the loaded rifle. She kept beside the fireplace and moved cautiously toward the window. Wild animals sometimes sought shelter during severe storms, and a desperate bear or mountain lion could easily break through the cabin's wooden walls. She peered through the frost-covered glass, trying to make sense of the shapes moving in the swirling snow. The wind was howling so loudly that it was impossible to hear anything else, but she thought she could make out a dark mass near the front of the cabin. It was too small to be a bear, too large to be a wolf. As she watched, the shape moved slightly, and she realized with a shock that it was a person. Someone was out there in the storm, collapsed against her cabin wall. Maggie's mind raced through the possibilities. A traveler caught in the blizzard, another homesteader seeking shelter, a stranger with unknown intentions. In the territory, isolated women learned to be cautious of unexpected visitors, especially during times when normal social constraints were suspended by desperate circumstances. But as she watched, the figure didn't move again. Whoever it was appeared to be unconscious, possibly dying from exposure. Maggie had perhaps minutes to decide whether to risk opening her door to help a stranger or to wait safely inside while another human being froze to death on her doorstep. The choice, when it came down to it, was no choice at all. Maggie set the rifle aside and grabbed her heavy coat from its peg near the door. She wrapped a scarf around her face and pulled on her thickest gloves, then lifted the wooden bar that secured the door from the inside. The wind immediately tried to tear the door from her grasp as she opened it, and snow whirled into the cabin with vicious intensity. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. The figure was huddled against the cabin wall just to the left of the door, barely visible in the storm. Maggie could see now that it was an elderly man, his dark skin and long gray hair marking him as a Native American. His clothes were traditional buckskins, and furs now soaked through and crusted with ice. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Without hesitation, Maggie grabbed the man under his arms and began dragging him toward the door. He was heavier than she had expected, but desperation gave her strength. The wind fought her every step, and by the time she had maneuvered his limp form across the threshold, her own face was numb with cold, and her hands ached despite the thick gloves. She slammed the door shut and barred it again, then turned her attention to the unconscious man. His lips were blue, his skin deadly pale beneath the weathered bronze. His clothes were not just wet but frozen, the buckskin stiff as boards. If she didn't act quickly, he would die in her cabin instead of outside it. Maggie had some experience with treating exposure from her time helping at the settlement's makeshift clinic during particularly harsh winters. The first priority was to get the victim warm, but too much heat too quickly could be as dangerous as the cold itself. She dragged him closer to the fire but not directly in front of it, then began the difficult task of removing his frozen clothing. Thus, buckskin shirt was laced with leather thongs that her numb fingers struggled to untie. The man's skin beneath was frighteningly cold, but she could still detect a faint pulse at his throat. His breathing was so shallow that she had to put her ear close to his mouth to confirm he was still alive. As she worked to strip away the wet garments, she noticed details that spoke to his identity and status. The buckskin was of exceptional quality, decorated with intricate beadwork that suggested someone of importance. Around his neck hung a medicine bundle, a small leather pouch that she knew held sacred items. His hair was braided with care, and despite his current condition, she could see that he was a man accustomed to respect and dignity. The realization that she was likely dealing with a Blackfoot elder added another layer of complexity to the situation. The relationship between white settlers and the Blackfoot Nation was tense at best, marked by decades of broken treaties, misunderstandings, and violence on both sides. Just 2 years ago, there had been a significant conflict over hunting rights that had resulted in deaths and increased military presence in the region. But those considerations seemed irrelevant as she looked at the unconscious man who was depending on her for his life. Whatever political complications might arise later, right now he was simply a human being in desperate need of help. Maggie wrapped him in every blanket she owned, then heated water on the stove to make warm broth. She had learned that victims of severe exposure needed to be warmed from the inside as well as the outside. As she waited for the water to heat, she examined him more carefully for signs of frostbite or other injuries. His hands and feet showed the telltale white patches of frostbite, but it didn't appear to be severe. His pulse was growing stronger, and his breathing seemed less labored. Most encouraging of all, when she lifted his eyelids to check his pupils, she saw them react normally to the firelight. For the next hour, Maggie worked steadily to warm the stranger back to life. She spooned warm broth between his lips, massaged his hands and feet to restore circulation, and adjusted the blankets to ensure he wasn't overheating. Gradually, color began to return to his face, and his breathing became more regular. As the afternoon wore on, and her patient showed signs of improvement, Maggie began to consider the implications of what she had done. She was now sharing her limited shelter and supplies with a complete stranger during the worst blizzard in memory. More significantly, when this man recovered and eventually left, he would report her location and circumstances to others. Her carefully maintained isolation would be broken, but as she looked at the elderly man's peaceful face, now relaxed in sleep rather than unconsciousness, she found she didn't regret her decision. There were some things more important than privacy or even personal safety, some choices that defined not just what a person did, but who they were at their core. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small cabin, two people from very different worlds shared warmth and shelter. Maggie settled into her chair near the fire, keeping watch over her unexpected guest as darkness fell across the Montana wilderness. She had no way of knowing that her simple act of human kindness was about to set in motion events that would test everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and finding a place to truly belong. The elderly man stirred slightly in his sleep, murmuring words in a language she didn't understand. Maggie added another log to the fire and pulled her own blanket closer around her shoulders. Whatever consequences awaited her decision to help a stranger, she would face them when they came. For now, it was enough that 2 people had survived. Another day in an unforgiving wilderness, and that the ancient human obligation to help those in need had triumphed over fear and prejudice. Outside, the wind continued to howl and the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, something had changed forever. The solitary homesteader, who had once believed that needing no one was a form of strength, was about to discover that sometimes the greatest courage comes from opening your door to the unknown, even when a blizzard is trying to tear the world apart. As night deepened, Maggie found herself studying the stranger's face in the firelight. His features were strong and dignified, with deep lines that spoke of many winters survived and much wisdom earned. The grey in his hair wasn't the premature aging of hardship, but the natural silver of a man who had lived long enough to be respected by his people. His hands, now warming beneath the blankets, were scarred and calloused from decades of skilled work, but she could see they had once been powerful and sure. The medicine bundle around his neck fascinated her. She had heard about such things from traders and soldiers who passed through Cedar Falls, but she had never seen one up close. The leather was old and soft, darkened by years of handling, and she could see intricate beadwork along the edges. Whatever was inside that small pouch was precious enough that he had clutched it even while unconscious, even while dying in the snow. Around midnight the man's breathing changed, becoming deeper and more regular. His eyelids fluttered, and Maggie leaned forward, unsure what to expect when he regained consciousness. Would he be grateful for her help, or would he see her as a threat? She had heard conflicting stories about the Blackfoot people. Some settlers spoke of them with respect, describing honorable warriors and wise leaders. Others painted them as savage enemies who showed no mercy to white intruders on their ancestral lands. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere between these extremes, but she had no real knowledge to guide her. Her education in Ohio had included geography and literature, mathematics and music, but nothing about the indigenous peoples of the American West. She was operating purely on instinct and the basic human understanding that suffering recognized no boundaries of race or culture. When the stranger's eyes finally opened, they were alert and intelligent, showing none of the confusion she might have expected from someone who had nearly died of exposure. He looked directly at her, taking in her face, her clothing, the cabin around them. His gaze moved to the rifle she had placed within easy reach, then back to her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he attempted to sit up, moving slowly and carefully. Maggie reached out to help steady him, and he accepted her assistance without resistance. When he was upright, wrapped in blankets with his back against the cabin wall, he spoke for the first time, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You brought me inside," he said in English that was accented but clear. His voice was deep and measured, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to when he spoke. "You were dying in the snow," Maggie replied simply. "I couldn't leave." "You there?" He nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. "I am called Grey Wolf Walking. I was traveling to the winter camp when the storm overtook me. My horse fell into a ravine, and I have been walking for 2 days. "I'm Maggie Thompson," she said, then felt compelled to add, "This is my homestead." "A woman alone," he observed, "but without judgment. You are far from your people." "By choice," Maggie said, surprised by her own honesty. There was something about this man's direct manner that invited straight answers. Grey Wolf, walking, studied her face for a moment longer, then reached for the medicine bundle at his throat. His fingers moved over it with obvious reverence, and Maggie saw relief in his expression as he confirmed it was still intact. "You did not touch this," he said. "It was not a question. No. I could see it was important to you. It contains the sacred items of my family line. To lose it would be to lose the connection to my ancestors, to all who came before me." He looked at her with something that might have been approval. "You understand respect, even for things you do not know." The conversation lapsed into silence, but it was not uncomfortable. Grey Wolf, walking, seemed content to gather his strength, while Maggie found herself oddly at ease with this stranger who spoke with such dignity and directness. She heated more broth and offered it to him, which he accepted gratefully. "How long have I been here?" he asked between careful sips. "Since this afternoon. You've been unconscious for perhaps 6 hours." He nodded, glancing toward the window where snow still swirled past in the lamplight. "The storm will continue for at least another day, perhaps 2. I have seen such storms before. The spirits of winter are angry this year." Maggie wasn't sure how to respond to the spiritual interpretation, so she focused on the practical implications. "You're welcome to stay until it's safe to travel. I have enough food for both of us, and you need time to recover your strength." "And what do you ask in return?" The question was asked without suspicion, but with the practical understanding of someone who knew that nothing in life came without cost. "Nothing," Maggie said, and meant it. "Just that you get well and make it safely to your family." Grey Wolf, walking, considered this answer for a long moment. "Among my people, a debt of life must be repaid. You have given me back my existence when the cold spirits would have claimed it. This creates an obligation that cannot be ignored." "I don't understand obligations like that," Maggie said honestly. "Where I come from, helping someone in trouble is just what decent people do. And where I come from, the preservation of honor requires that kindness be answered with kindness, that generosity be met with generosity. You have saved the life of Grey Wolf, walking, elder of the Blackfoot Nation, keeper of the stories, father of warriors. This will not be forgotten." There was something in his tone that made Maggie think he meant more than simple gratitude. She was about to ask what he meant when a particularly violent gust of wind struck the cabin, making the entire structure groan and causing them both to look toward the door with concern. "Your house is well built," Grey Wolf, walking, observed. "But this storm tests everything." "I built it myself," Maggie said, then immediately wondered why she had felt the need to share that information. A woman who builds her own shelter, who lives alone in the wilderness, who saves the lives of strangers. He nodded slowly. "You are not like the other white settlers I have known." "How many have you known?" "Enough to understand that most fear us, and most believe we are less than human. Some have been kind, but usually because they wanted something from us. You ask for nothing, expect nothing. This is unusual." Maggie found herself wanting to know more about his experiences with her people, but she sensed this was not the time for such questions. The man was still recovering from his ordeal, and pushing for too much conversation might tax his strength. "You should rest more," she suggested. "Tomorrow we can talk if you feel stronger." Grey Wolf, walking, settled back against his blankets, but his eyes remained thoughtful. "Tell me, Maggie Thompson, who builds houses and saves lives, what brought you so far from your people that you live alone in this dangerous place?" The question caught her off guard. She had become accustomed to deflecting such inquiries from the occasional visitor to Cedar Falls, but something about this man's direct gaze made evasion seem pointless. "I made some mistakes back east," she said finally. "Trusted the wrong person, believed the wrong promises. When it all fell apart, staying meant living with the shame and whispers for the rest of my life. Leaving meant I could start over, be whoever I chose to be. And who have you chosen to be? The question was so simple, yet it struck to the heart of everything she had been wrestling with during these months of isolation. Who was she now, without her family's name or society's expectations or anyone else's definitions of what a woman should be? "I'm still figuring that out," she admitted. Grey Wolf Walking smiled for the first time since awakening, and it transformed his stern features completely. "That is an honest answer. Among my people, we believe that a person's true nature is revealed, not in comfort, but in the moments when they must choose between safety and doing what is right. Tonight, you showed me who you are." As the fire settled lower and the storm continued its assault on the cabin, Maggie found herself thinking about his words. She had acted without conscious thought when she saw someone in need, but perhaps that was exactly the point. Perhaps who we really are is revealed in those unguarded moments when we don't have time to calculate the consequences of our actions. The next morning would bring new challenges and decisions, but for now, it was enough. The two very different people had found common ground in the simple recognition of shared humanity. Whatever else happened, Maggie knew that this night had changed something fundamental in her understanding of both herself and the world she had chosen to make her home. The morning of February 15th dawned with an eerie stillness that felt almost oppressive after 3 days of howling wind. Maggie woke to find Grey Wolf Walking already awake, sitting quietly by the window and watching the snow fall in large, gentle flakes. The violent blizzard had transformed overnight into a steady, peaceful snowfall that blanketed the landscape. "In pristine white, the storm's anger has passed," he observed, as Maggie stirred from her makeshift bed near the fireplace. "But the snow will continue for many hours yet." Maggie stretched her stiff muscles and added wood to the dying fire. Her back ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but she had insisted that Grey Wolf Walking take her bed while he recovered. The gesture had seemed to surprise him, though he had accepted with quiet dignity. "How are you feeling?" she asked, noting that his color had improved dramatically overnight. "Much stronger. Your care has been—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Healing. Both the body and the spirit needed warmth, and you provided both." As Maggie prepared coffee and heated leftover broth for breakfast, Grey Wolf Walking began to speak of his journey and the circumstances that had brought him to her door. His voice carried the cadence of a natural storyteller, painting vivid pictures with carefully chosen words. "I was traveling from our winter camp near the Sweetgrass Hills to visit my youngest son, Running Bear, who leads a band that winters near the Milk River," he began. "Running Bear's wife is expecting their first child, and I carry with me the blessing songs that must be sung over a new life entering our people." He touched the medicine bundle at his throat. "These songs have been passed down through 7 generations of my family. My grandfather sang them over my father sang them over me, and I have sung them over each of my 4 sons. Now it is time for Running Bear to learn them, so that he may sing them over his own child." Maggie found herself drawn into the story, imagining the weight of such responsibility. "How far is it to your son's camp?" "In good weather, 2 days of steady riding. But when the storm caught me, I was still half a day's journey from there." "Winter grounds?" His expression grew troubled. "My horse, Many Spots, was a good companion for 8 winters. When the ravine wall gave way beneath the snow, I could not save him. He broke his leg in the fall, and I—" He paused, the memory clearly painful. "I gave him peace as quickly as I could." The practical reality of his situation became clear to Maggie. Without a horse, in deep snow and bitter cold, the journey to his son's camp would take days on foot. The blizzard had caught him at the worst possible moment, stranded between destinations with no shelter and rapidly failing light. "You said you walked for 2 days before you reached my cabin," she said. "That must have been incredibly difficult." Grey Wolf Walking nodded solemnly. "The first day, I still had hope of reaching shelter before the storm worsened. There is a trading post owned by a French trapper named Dubois, perhaps 8 miles northeast of here. I had planned to wait out the weather there and continue when it was safe." "Pierre Dubois," Maggie said, recognizing the name. "I've met him. He comes through Cedar Falls sometimes to trade." "Yes, that one. But when I reached his post, it was empty, boarded up for the winter. I learned later from tracks in the snow that he had left for Fort Benton 2 weeks ago, probably to wait out the worst of the winter season in more comfortable surroundings." Maggie could imagine the crushing disappointment of reaching what should have been safety, only to find it barred against him. "So you had to keep walking, in weather that was growing worse by the hour. I had enough dried meat for 3 days, but the cold makes the body burn food like kindling. By the 2nd day, my strength was failing, and I began to understand that I might not survive to sing the blessing songs for my grandchild." The weight of this responsibility seemed to rest heavily on the old man's shoulders. Maggie began to understand that his journey was about more than visiting family. It was about preserving something sacred that could not be replaced if it were lost. "Tell me about these blessing songs," she asked gently. "What makes them so important?" Grey Wolf Walking's eyes took on a distant look, as if he were seeing across vast stretches of time. "Among the Blackfoot, we believe that every child born into the world arrives with a specific purpose, a unique gift they will bring to the people. But this purpose must be awakened and acknowledged through proper ceremony, or the child may live their entire life without understanding why they were born." He gestured toward the medicine bundle. "The blessing songs help to open the pathway between the physical world and the spirit world, so that the child's purpose can be revealed to those who love them. Without these songs, sung at the proper time by the proper person, the child's spirit may remain clouded, unable to find their true path." Maggie found herself fascinated by this concept. "And this responsibility falls specifically to grandfathers? To the eldest male in the family line who carries the sacred knowledge. I learned these songs from my own grandfather when I was running Bear's age. He was dying of the white man's disease, what you call smallpox, and he called me to his side to pass on the songs that must not die with him." The mention of smallpox brought a shadow to Grey Wolf Walking's features. Maggie knew enough about the disease's impact on native populations to understand that this was likely a painful memory involving far more loss than just one grandfather. "That epidemic took many of our people," he continued, confirming her suspicions. "Whole families are gone in a matter of days, children orphaned, elders dying before they could pass on their knowledge. We lost not just lives, but pieces of our collective memory that can never be recovered." "I'm sorry," Maggie said quietly. "I know the disease has been devastating to your people." Grey Wolf Walking studied her face for a moment. "You speak of your people and my people as if we are a separate species. Yet last night you risked your own safety to save the life of a stranger. Perhaps the divisions are not as absolute as both our peoples sometimes believe." This observation led Maggie to reflect on her own journey to this isolated homestead and the events that had shaped her understanding of belonging and identity. As she refilled their coffee cups, she found herself sharing details of her past that she had never spoken aloud to anyone in Montana. "I grew up in a world where everything was divided into categories," she began. "Proper and improper, suitable and unsuitable. There were rules for everything, how a woman should dress, how she should speak, whom she should marry, what she was allowed to think about topics that mattered." Grey Wolf Walking listened with the patient attention of someone accustomed to hearing the full shape of a story before offering judgment or advice. My father, Henry Worthington, owned the largest bank in Columbus, Ohio. We lived in a mansion with 16 rooms, had servants to tend to our every need, and moved in circles where everyone knew everyone else's business going back 3 generations. She paused, remembering the suffocating feeling of that existence. I was expected to marry well, produce children, and spend my life hosting tea parties and managing household staff. But this did not satisfy you, Grey Wolf Walking observed. It felt like slowly dying. I wanted to understand how the bank actually worked, how investments were made, how money moved from one place to another. I wanted to read books about philosophy and science, not just novels and poetry that were deemed appropriate for ladies. Most of all, I wanted to have opinions about politics and business and be taken seriously when I expressed them. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had become her refuge. My father indulged what he called my intellectual curiosities to some extent. He let me sit in on business meetings occasionally, thinking it was harmless as long as I understood I would never actually participate in running the bank. But you wanted more than to observe, Grey Wolf Walking said, understanding where the story was leading much more. And when his business partner, Richard Blackwood, began paying attention to my ideas and treating them with respect, I thought I had found someone who truly understood me. The memory still carried a sting of embarrassment and betrayal. Richard was handsome, charming, and 15 years older than me. He convinced me that he shared my progressive views about women's capabilities. He said he wanted a true partner, not just a decorative wife. Maggie returned to her seat, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee cup. For 6 months, I believed I had found my perfect match. Richard would visit our home for business meetings with my father, and afterward, he would seek out my opinions on the matters they had discussed. He praised my intelligence, encouraged my ambitions, and gradually convinced me that we were meant to be together. Your father approved of this courtship? My father was delighted. Richard came from an old, wealthy family, and the marriage would have strengthened both their business and social positions. The engagement was announced at a grand party that was the social event of the season. Grey Wolf Walking waited patiently as Maggie gathered herself to continue the more painful part of her story. 2 weeks before our wedding, I discovered that Richard had been using information I had shared with him, insights about my father's business strategies, details about upcoming investments, to manipulate the markets for his own profit. Worse, he had been secretly organizing a group of investors to buy out my father's controlling interest in the bank. The betrayal still felt sharp, even after all this time. When I confronted him, he laughed. He told me that my intellectual curiosities had been useful for gaining access to information, but that once we were married, I would naturally settle into the proper role of a wife and forget about such masculine concerns. He used your trust to steal from your family, Grey Wolf Walking said, his voice carrying quiet anger, and he made it clear that he had never taken my ideas seriously. I had been nothing more than a convenient source of insider information, wrapped in an attractive package that would look good on his arm at social functions. Maggie set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. When I tried to warn my father about Richard's plans, he accused me of having feminine hysteria and suggested that I was simply nervous about the approaching wedding. Your father did not believe you? He couldn't conceive that his business partner would betray him, and he certainly couldn't imagine that his daughter might have a better understanding of the situation than he did. When Richard's consortium made their move to acquire the bank 3 days later, my father was completely unprepared. The humiliation of that period came flooding back. The shock on her father's face when he realized she had been right, the whispered conversations at social gatherings, the pointed looks and barely concealed gossip that followed her everywhere. The bank survived, but barely. My father managed to retain control, but only by selling off other investments and taking on significant debt. Richard's reputation was ruined when the details of his scheme became public, but so was mine. She met Grey Wolf Walking's eyes directly, a woman who had been so bold as to interfere in men's business, who had broken an engagement in such a dramatic fashion, was clearly unsuitable for polite society. So you left your family and came west. I used my inheritance, money my mother had left me that couldn't be touched by anyone else, to disappear. I legally changed my name, bought supplies and a wagon, and headed for the territories where a person's past mattered less than their ability to survive. Grey Wolf Walking considered this story thoughtfully. Among my people, a woman who sees clearly and speaks truth is valued, not shunned. Your father's people are strange to punish wisdom and reward blindness. Not all white people think that way, Maggie said, though she appreciated his support. But enough to do that, staying in Ohio would have meant living with the consequences of being right about something I wasn't supposed to understand. And so you built this place, far from those who would judge you for having intelligence. I thought isolation would give me freedom. No one to answer to, no one to disappoint, no expectations to fulfill except my own. She gestured around the small cabin. For 18 months, I convinced myself that being alone was a form of strength. But now you question this belief? Maggie was quiet for a long moment, considering how to articulate thoughts that had been forming slowly over the past day. Watching you nearly die in the snow, bringing you inside, talking with you, it's reminded me that we're all connected in ways that isolation can't erase. Maybe true strength isn't about needing no one. Maybe it's about knowing when to help and when to accept help. Grey Wolf Walking nodded slowly. Wisdom often comes from pain, but only if we are willing to learn from it rather than simply endure it. You have learned, Maggie Thompson. Your heart remained open even when your trust was broken. As the day progressed and the snow continued to fall steadily outside, their conversation ranged across many topics. Grey Wolf Walking shared stories of his own youth, of learning to hunt and fight and lead, of the gradual encroachment of white settlers on Blackfoot lands, and the difficult decisions his people faced about how to respond. When I was young, like your Richard Blackwood, I believed that all white people were the same, he admitted. I saw them as invaders who took without asking, who made promises they never intended to keep, who saw our people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with equal claim to the earth. What changed your mind? Time, experience, meeting individuals rather than just encountering groups. There was a missionary couple, David and Mary Henderson, who came to our territory. When I was perhaps 30 winters old, they were different from the others. Grey Wolf Walking's expression grew thoughtful as he recalled the memory. They learned our language properly. Not just a few words for trading. They asked permission before settling on our lands, and when that permission was granted, they honored the boundaries that were set. Most importantly, they listened to our stories and shared their own, seeking understanding rather than dominance. Did they convert many of your people to Christianity? Some. But that was not why they were important to us. They showed us that not all white people saw us as savages to be eliminated or tamed. They treated us as equals, worthy of respect and consideration. Through them, I learned that judging all people by the actions of some was a form of blindness that hurt both sides. This observation resonated deeply with Maggie's own experiences. I suppose I did something similar when I decided to isolate myself completely. I let Richard's betrayal and my father's disappointment convince me that all relationships were dangerous. And yet when a stranger appeared at your door, you opened it without hesitation. I couldn't do otherwise. Whatever fear or disappointment I might carry, it didn't seem important when compared to someone's life. As afternoon faded toward evening, Grey Wolf Walking grew more restless, clearly anxious about his son and the unborn grandchild who awaited his arrival. The snow had finally stopped falling, but the drifts outside the cabin were deep enough to make travel dangerous for someone still recovering from exposure. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds, I must continue my journey," he announced. "Running Bear's wife is near her time, and the blessing songs must be ready when the child arrives." "Are you strong enough for such a journey on foot?" Maggie asked, concerned about his welfare despite understanding his urgency. "I will have to be. The responsibility cannot be delayed." He touched the medicine bundle again, a gesture that seemed automatic when he spoke of his duties. "But I will not forget the debt I owe you, Maggie Thompson. Among my people, such debts are not taken lightly. I told you I don't expect anything in return, and I told you that makes the debt even more significant. Kindness given without expectation of reward is the rarest and most precious gift." His dark eyes held hers steadily. "What I owe you will be repaid, though perhaps not in the way you might expect." Something in his tone suggested layers of meaning that Maggie didn't fully understand, but before she could ask for clarification, exhaustion overtook both of them. The emotional weight of sharing their stories, combined with the physical stress of the past few days, left them both ready for sleep. As they settled in for their second night together, Maggie found herself thinking about the unexpected connection she had formed with this stranger from a completely different world. Their conversation had revealed similarities that transcended cultural boundaries. Both had been misunderstood by their own people. Both had learned hard lessons about trust and betrayal. Both carried responsibilities that weighed heavily on their shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight had been something Maggie hadn't experienced since leaving Ohio. Genuine conversation with someone who listened without judging, who shared their own vulnerabilities in return for hers, who treated her as an equal worthy of respect and consideration. For the first time in 18 months, she didn't feel entirely alone in the world. Dawn on February 16th broke crystal clear, with a pale sun casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. The silence was profound after days of howling wind, broken only by the occasional crack of settling timber and the soft whisper of snow sliding from the cabin's roof. Grey Wolf Walking stood at the window, fully dressed in his now dry buckskins, studying the transformed landscape with the practiced eye of someone who had navigated wilderness for 70 years. "The snow is deep, but the wind has packed it in places," he observed as Maggie joined him with steaming cups of coffee. "If I follow the ridgelines where the drifts are thinner, I can make good time toward Running Bear's camp." Maggie frowned, noting that despite his improved condition, the elderly man still moved with careful deliberation. "Are you certain you're strong enough? You nearly died 3 days ago." "My strength returns with each hour, and my grandson waits to be born. I cannot delay any longer." He accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "Among my people there are certain responsibilities that supersede personal comfort or even personal safety." As they prepared a substantial breakfast from Maggie's dwindling supplies, Grey Wolf Walking shared more details about his family and the urgency of his mission. Running Bear was his youngest son, born late in life to his second wife after his first wife and 2 children had died in a cholera outbreak. The young man had grown into a respected leader, but this would be his first child, and Blackfoot tradition demanded that the blessing songs be taught before the birth, not after. "The songs create a spiritual pathway," Grey Wolf Walking explained, as he carefully packed his few possessions. "They must be sung by the grandfather while the child still rests in the mother's womb. so that the baby's spirit can hear them and understand its welcome into the world. If Vi arrived too late, he didn't finish the sentence, but Maggie understood the weight of potential failure. This wasn't simply about missing a family celebration. It was about preserving a sacred tradition that had been passed down through generations. "How will you find your way?" she asked, looking out at the featureless expanse of snow that stretched in every direction. "Everything looks the same now," Grey Wolf, walking, smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "You see emptiness where I see a map written in the language of the land. The way snow collects around certain rocks, the direction branches bend on the trees, the patterns stars make as they wheel across the sky. All these things speak to those who know how to listen." He moved to the door, then paused, turning back to face her with an expression of profound solemnity. "Maggie Thompson, I want you to understand something important. What you have done for me, saving my life, sharing your food and shelter, asking nothing in return, this creates what my people call a sacred obligation. The debt I owe you cannot be settled with words or gifts. It requires action. I keep telling you I don't expect. What you expect and what honor demands are different things." His voice carried the authority of absolute conviction. "In 7 days' time, when the moon is full, you will understand what I mean." Before Maggie could ask what he meant by this cryptic statement, Grey Wolf, walking, stepped outside into the brilliant morning air. She followed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cold that bit through her clothing with immediate intensity. The old man stood for a moment in the deep snow, breathing deeply and orienting himself with the sun and distant landmarks. Then he began to walk, moving with surprising grace despite the challenging conditions. Maggie watched as he made his way up the slope behind her cabin, following what appeared to be a completely random path, but which she suspected was guided by knowledge accumulated over decades of wilderness travel. At the crest of the ridge, Grey Wolf walking paused and turned back toward the cabin. Even at a distance, Maggie could see him raise his hand in farewell, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and promise. Then he disappeared over the ridge, leaving only a line of tracks in the snow to mark his passage. Maggie stood outside until the cold drove her back indoors, feeling strangely bereft after the unexpected companionship of the past 2 days. The cabin seemed smaller and quieter than before, despite being exactly as it had been 3 days earlier. She found herself listening for the sound of his voice, looking toward the place where he had slept, remembering fragments of their conversations. For the rest of that day and the next, she threw herself into practical tasks with determined energy. She reorganized her supplies, mended clothing that had been neglected during the storm, and even began work on expanding her furniture collection using wood from the emergency supply she had been saving. Staying busy helped keep her mind off the growing sense of isolation that threatened to overwhelm her. But as the days passed, Maggie found herself thinking constantly about Grey Wolf Walking's parting words. What had he meant by a sacred obligation? What was supposed to happen in 7 days when the moon was full? She knew enough about Native American cultures to understand that they often had different concepts of time and reciprocity than white society. But his specific phrasing had carried an ominous certainty that worried her. On February 20th, 4 days after Grey Wolf Walking's departure, Maggie was chopping firewood behind her cabin when she heard an unusual sound in the distance. It was rhythmic and purposeful, the sound of horses moving through snow. Her first thought was relief. Perhaps it was Jacob Morrison checking on her after the storm, or even a supply wagon from Cedar Falls making the rounds to isolated homesteads. But as the sound grew closer, she realized there were too many horses for a casual visit or supply run. The rhythm suggested a large group moving in formation, traveling with military precision. Maggie set down her axe and moved to the front of the cabin, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun as she scanned the horizon. What she saw made her blood freeze in her veins. A column of at least 30 riders was approaching from the northwest, moving steadily across the snow-covered plain. Even at a distance, she could see they were Native Americans, their horses and clothing unmistakably different from white cavalry or civilian riders. They rode in perfect formation, with scouts ranging ahead and to the sides, their progress deliberate and unhurried. Maggie's first instinct was to run inside, bar the door, and prepare for a siege. Stories of Indian raids were common currency in settlements throughout the territory, and a lone woman on an isolated homestead was exactly the kind of vulnerable target that raiders typically sought. Her rifle was loaded and ready, and she had enough ammunition to hold off attackers for a considerable time if necessary, but something about the approaching riders gave her pause. They weren't moving with the chaotic urgency of a war party, nor were they attempting to approach stealthily. Their formation was formal, almost ceremonial, and as they drew closer, she could see that many carried what appeared to be staffs or poles, decorated with feathers and other ornaments. When the column was perhaps half a mile away, it stopped. 3 riders separated from the main group and continued forward at a measured pace. As they approached, Maggie could see that the center rider was an imposing figure on a magnificent black horse, flanked by 2 younger men who carried themselves. With the bearing of experienced warriors, her heart hammered in her chest as the 3 riders drew near enough for her to make out their faces. The man in the center was perhaps 50 years old, with strong features and an elaborate headdress that spoke of high rank and authority. His companions were younger, one carrying a staff topped with eagle feathers, the other holding what appeared to be a ceremonial pipe. When they were within speaking distance, the leader raised his hand in a gesture that was clearly meant to indicate peaceful intentions. He spoke in a voice that carried easily across the snow-covered ground, his English accented but perfectly clear. "I am Chief Red Hawk of the Blackfoot Nation. I seek the woman called Maggie Thompson, who gave shelter to my uncle, Grey Wolf Walking. During the great storm," relief flooded through Maggie so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. These weren't raiders. They were Grey Wolf Walking's people, come for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, but which clearly weren't hostile. She stepped forward, her hands visible and empty, trying to project calm confidence, despite her racing heart. "I am Maggie Thompson," she called back. "Grey Wolf Walking stayed here for 2 nights. He left 4 days ago to continue his journey to his son's camp." Chief Red Hawk nodded gravely. He reached Running Bear safely, and in time to sing the blessing songs for his grandson, who was born 3 days ago. The child is healthy and strong, and the sacred traditions have been preserved for another generation. The formal way he delivered. This information suggested it was more than casual news sharing. There was clearly more to this visit than simply updating her on Grey Wolf Walking's welfare. "I'm glad to hear he made it safely," Maggie replied, uncertain what response was expected of her. "My uncle has told me of your kindness," Chief Red Hawk continued. "How you found him dying in the snow and brought him into your home. How you shared your food and warmth, asking nothing in return. How you respected the sacred items he carried and treated him with honor despite the fact that our peoples have not always been at peace." Maggie felt a growing sense of unease. The formal tone, the ceremonial approach, the presence of so many warriors, all of it suggested this was far more significant than a simple thank you visit. "Anyone would have done the same," she said, though even as the words left her mouth she suspected they weren't true. How many white settlers would have risked opening their doors to a Native American stranger during a blizzard? "No, Chief Red," Hawk said firmly, "not anyone would have done what you did. Most of your people fear us, and most of mine distrust yours. You acted with courage and compassion that transcends the boundaries our peoples have drawn between us." He gestured toward the larger group of riders still waiting at a respectful distance. Grey Wolf Walking has declared a sacred debt to you, one that can only be repaid through the formal customs of our people. We have come to offer you a choice that will honor both your kindness and our traditions." "What kind of choice?" Maggie asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. "You may continue to live here as you have, alone and isolated, and we will ensure that no harm comes to you from any Blackfoot band as long as you remain on this land. You will be under our protection, marked as a friend to our people." The offer was generous beyond anything Maggie could have imagined, but something in Chief Redhawk's tone suggested there was more to come. "Or," she prompted, "or you may accept a place among us, not as a captive or servant, but as an adopted daughter of the Blackfoot Nation, with all the rights and responsibilities that such a position entails. You would be welcome in our camps, free to come and go as you choose, treated as family by our people." The magnitude of what he was offering struck Maggie speechless. Adoption into a Native American tribe was almost unheard of for white settlers, especially for women. It represented not just protection and belonging, but acceptance into a culture that most whites considered savage and primitive. I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "You need not decide immediately," Chief Redhawk said, his stern expression softening slightly. "But know that this offer comes not just from gratitude, but from recognition of your character. Grey Wolf Walking is our most respected elder, keeper of our most sacred traditions. His judgment of your worth carries great weight among our people." One of the younger warriors leaned forward and spoke quietly in their native language. Chief Redhawk listened, then nodded. "My nephew reminds me that we have brought gifts to mark this occasion, regardless of what choice you make." He gestured, and several riders from the main group began approaching, leading pack horses laden with various items. As the gifts were unloaded in front of her cabin, Maggie found herself overwhelmed by their generosity. There were warm buffalo robes that would provide better insulation than anything she owned, intricately beaded clothing that represented countless hours of skilled work, tools crafted from bone and metal that would make her daily tasks easier, and foods that would supplement her diet through the remainder of winter. Most precious of all was a magnificent horse, a young mare with intelligent eyes and a coat the color of autumn leaves. The animal was clearly well-trained and valuable, the kind of gift that spoke to the high regard in which she was held. "Her name is Swift Wind," Chief Redhawk explained. "She is swift and sure-footed, with the intelligence to find her way home even in bad weather. She is yours whether you choose to remain here or come with us." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Chief Redhawk and his companions accepted Maggie's invitation to share a meal, though most of the warriors remained at their respectful distance. The conversation around her simple table was unlike anything she had ever experienced, formal yet warm, bridging cultural gaps through careful translation and patient explanation. She learned that Grey Wolf Walking was not just any elder, but a man whose wisdom and spiritual knowledge made him one of the most revered figures in Blackfoot society. His word carried weight in tribal councils, and his assessment of her character had prompted this unprecedented offer of adoption. She also learned more about the current state of relations between the Blackfoot Nation and white settlers. Chief Redhawk spoke candidly about the pressures his people faced: shrinking hunting grounds, broken treaties, the constant encroachment of settlers and military forces. The decision to offer adoption to a white woman was controversial even within his own tribe, but Grey Wolf Walking's influence had made it possible. "Times are changing," Chief Redhawk admitted as they shared coffee in the gathering dusk. "Our old ways of life are being challenged by forces we cannot stop. Some of our people believe we must fight to the death to preserve our traditions." Others believe we must adapt or be destroyed. And what do you believe? Maggie asked. I believe wisdom lies in finding a path between the extremes. Complete resistance leads to annihilation. Complete submission leads to the death of our culture. But perhaps there is a way to preserve what is most important while adapting to the realities we cannot change. He looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. You represent a possibility that most of my people have never considered, that understanding between our peoples might be possible, that friendship might exist across the boundaries that divide us. If you were to accept our offer of adoption, you would become a bridge between two worlds, helping each to understand the other. The weight of such responsibility was staggering. Maggie had come to Montana seeking nothing more than isolation and independence. Now she was being offered a role that could influence the relationship between entire peoples, for better or worse. As the Blackfoot delegation prepared to depart, Chief Redhawk outlined the practical details of her choices. If she decided to accept adoption, they would return in 1 month's time to escort her to their main camp, where formal ceremonies would be conducted. If she chose to remain independent, but under their protection, they would establish regular contact to ensure her safety and well-being. Take time to consider carefully, he advised. This decision will shape not just your own future, but perhaps the future of relations between our peoples. Grey Wolf. Walking believes you have the wisdom to choose well, but the choice must be yours alone. After the delegation departed, disappearing into the gathering darkness as silently as they had arrived, Maggie sat alone in her cabin, surrounded by their generous gifts. The buffalo robes radiated warmth, the beaded clothing glowed in the firelight, and outside, swift wind whispered softly from the makeshift corral she had hastily constructed. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Maggie faced a choice that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. She could remain as she was, protected but isolated, safe but alone. Or she could step into an unknown future that offered belonging and purpose, but also uncertainty and challenges she couldn't yet imagine. As she lay down to sleep that night, wrapped in a buffalo robe that was warmer than any bedding she had ever known, Maggie realized that Grey Wolf Walking had been right about sacred obligations creating unexpected consequences. Her simple act of kindness during a blizzard had opened doors to possibilities she had never dreamed existed. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of her month-long period of consideration, 30 days to decide between the familiar isolation she had chosen and an unknown future that might offer something far more valuable than safety, a chance to belong somewhere, to matter to people who valued her not for her family name or social position, but for the content of her character. The full moon Grey Wolf Walking had mentioned was still 3 days away, but already its approaching light seemed to be illuminating choices that would determine whether the rest of her life would be spent in solitude or in service to something larger than herself. The days following Chief Redhawk's visit blurred, together in a haze of internal conflict and restless energy. Maggie found herself unable to focus on routine tasks, her mind constantly cycling between the two paths laid before her. She would begin mending a torn shirt only to abandon it halfway through, start preparing a meal only to forget about it. While staring out the window at the endless expanse of snow, swift wind proved to be a welcome distraction from her churning thoughts. The mare was everything Chief Redhawk had promised, intelligent, gentle, and surprisingly affectionate for a horse that had been raised among people she had never met. Each morning, Maggie would venture out to feed and groom her, finding peace in the simple rhythm of caring for another living creature. It was during one of these morning visits to the makeshift corral that she encountered her first test of the protection Chief Redhawk had promised. She was brushing Swift Wind's copper-colored coat when the sound of approaching riders reached her ears. Unlike the ceremonial precision of the Blackfoot delegation, these riders moved with the hurried, careless pace of men in pursuit of something. 3. White men emerged from the tree line, their horses lathered and steaming in the cold air. Maggie recognized the type immediately: drifters and troublemakers who haunted the edges of frontier settlements, taking what they wanted from those too isolated or vulnerable to resist. Their leader was a heavy-set man with a scarred face and predatory eyes that immediately fixed on Swiftwind with obvious avarice. "Well, well," he called out as the trio approached the cabin. "Looks like somebody's been doing some trading with the hostiles. That's a fine piece of horseflesh for a woman living alone in the middle of nowhere." Maggie straightened, her hand moving instinctively toward the knife at her belt. "The horse is mine, legally acquired. You men have no business here." The scarred man laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Frank Dulles is my name, and I make it my business to keep track of valuable property in these parts. That mare there is worth more than this whole cabin and everything in it. Seems wasteful for one woman to keep such a prize to herself." His companions spread out to flank him, their intentions clear despite the veneer of casual conversation. These were men accustomed to taking what they wanted through intimidation and violence, confident that a lone woman would have no recourse against their depredations. "I suggest you move along," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I have neighbors who check on me regularly." "Do you now?" Dulles sneered, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. "Funny thing about neighbors in country like this, they tend to be mighty far away when trouble comes calling. And we haven't seen the hide nor hair of anyone else in this whole territory except for that party of redskins that came through here a few days back." The casual mention of having observed the Blackfoot delegation sent a chill through Maggie. These men had been watching her cabin, waiting for the right moment to strike. She began backing toward the cabin door, calculating the distance to her rifle. "Now I'm thinking that horse came from those Indians," Dulles continued, advancing slowly. "Which means it's probably stolen property to begin with. We'd be doing you a favor taking it off your hands before the cavalry shows up asking awkward questions about why you're harboring stolen goods." Before Maggie could respond, a new sound cut through the morning air, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, too many to count, coming fast from multiple directions. Dulles and his companions spun around, their confidence evaporating as they realized they were no longer the predators in this situation. Blackfoot warriors emerged from the forest on three sides, moving with tactical precision that spoke of years of warfare experience. They said nothing, made no threatening gestures, but their presence was more intimidating than any display of weapons could have been. These were not the ceremonial figures who had visited with Chief Redhawk, but working warriors in war paint and battle dress. The leader of this group was a young man Maggie recognized from the earlier delegation, though she hadn't learned his name. He rode his horse with the easy grace of someone born in the saddle, his dark eyes fixed on Dulles with an expression that promised swift and final retribution for any wrong move. "You men are on protected land," the warrior said in English that was more heavily accented than Chief Redhawk's, but perfectly comprehensible. "The woman is under the protection of the Blackfoot Nation. You will leave now." Dulles looked around at the circle of warriors surrounding him, his face pale beneath the grime and stubble. Whatever bluster he might have maintained against a lone woman evaporated completely in the face of armed opponents who could kill him and his companions without breaking a sweat. "We weren't causing any trouble," he stammered, backing toward his horse. "Just passing through, that's all." "Then continue passing through," the warrior replied, "and spread word among others like you. This woman and her property are protected. Any who threaten her will answer to us." The three would-be thieves mounted their horses with undignified haste and spurred away across the snow, not looking back until they had disappeared into the distant trees. The Blackfoot warriors watched them go with the patient attention of hunters tracking wounded prey. ensuring they were truly gone before relaxing their vigilance. The young leader approached Maggie, inclining his head respectfully. "I am Little Wolf, nephew to Chief Redhawk. We have been watching your cabin since our delegation departed to ensure the protection we promised is real and not merely words." "Thank you," Maggie said, her voice slightly shaky from the aftermath of fear and relief. "Those men were planning to steal my horse. Swift Wind is yours by right and by gift," Little Wolf replied firmly. "No one will take her from you while you remain under our protection. But this incident shows why Chief Redhawk believes you should consider joining our people permanently. Out here alone, you will always be vulnerable to men like those." After the warriors departed, melting back into the forest as silently as they had appeared, Maggie found herself profoundly shaken by the encounter. Not just by the threat itself, but by the implications of what had just occurred. The Blackfoot protection wasn't a theoretical promise. It was an active, ongoing commitment that had probably saved her life and certainly saved her property. For the first time since Chief Redhawk's visit, she began to seriously consider what accepting adoption would actually mean. She had been thinking of it in abstract terms, as a philosophical choice between cultures, but the reality was more concrete and immediate. It meant becoming part of a community that would stand ready to defend her, just as she would be expected, to contribute to their collective welfare. Over the next several days, Maggie found herself paying closer attention to signs of Blackfoot presence around her homestead. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see evidence of their surveillance: disturbed snow that indicated regular patrols, the occasional glimpse of a distant rider on a ridgeline, even small offerings left near her cabin that seemed to be tokens of respect or protection. The realization that she was being watched might have felt intrusive under other circumstances, but after the encounter with Dulles and his companions, it felt like a comforting presence. She was no longer truly alone in the wilderness, even when no one was visible. 2 weeks after Chief Redhawk's visit, as February gave way to March and the first hints of spring began to appear in slightly longer days and subtly changing light, Maggie decided to take an active step toward understanding what her choice might entail. Using landmarks Grey Wolf Walking had mentioned during their conversations, she saddled Swift Wind and set out to locate the winter camp where Running Bear and his family waited. The journey took most of a day, following game trails and natural features through country that was breathtakingly beautiful but utterly unforgiving to those without proper knowledge. Swift Wind proved her worth repeatedly, navigating snow-covered obstacles with sure-footed confidence and seeming to understand their destination even when Maggie wasn't certain of the route. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, casting long purple shadows across the snow, Maggie smelled wood smoke and heard the distant sounds of human activity. Following these signs, she created a low rise and found herself looking down into a sheltered valley where a small cluster of teepees had been erected near a frozen stream. Her arrival caused an immediate stir, with people emerging from their warm shelters to stare at the unexpected visitor. Children pointed and whispered, while adults gathered in small groups, clearly discussing her presence with curiosity and some concern. A white woman arriving alone at a Blackfoot camp was apparently unprecedented enough to warrant significant attention. Before Maggie could decide whether to approach or retreat, a familiar figure emerged from one of the larger teepees. Grey Wolf Walking moved with the measured dignity she remembered, but he looked healthier and more vital than he had during his ordeal at her cabin. When he saw her, his weathered face broke into a genuine smile of welcome. "Maggie Thompson," he called out in English, raising his hand in greeting. "You honor us with your presence. Come, dismount and be welcome among the family of Running Bear." The formal invitation seemed to settle the camp's uncertainty about her arrival. People stepped forward to help with Swift Wind, offering to care for the horse, while others gestured toward the largest teepee. Grey Wolf, walking himself, approached to help her down from the saddle, his eyes bright with what appeared to be pleasure at her unexpected visit. "I wanted to see," Maggie began, then paused, uncertain how to explain her motivations without seeming presumptuous. "You wanted to see what life among our people might be like," Grey Wolf walking finished for her. "This is wisdom. Important. Choices should be made with knowledge, not just with hope or fear." Inside the warm teepee, Maggie was introduced to Running Bear, a man of perhaps 30 years, whose strong features clearly marked him as Grey Wolf Walking's son. His wife, Morning Light, was a young woman with gentle eyes and a ready smile, despite having given birth only 2 weeks earlier, and cradled in her arms was the baby whose arrival had made Grey Wolf Walking's dangerous winter journey necessary. The child was tiny and perfect, with the dark hair and bronze skin of his parents, but an alertness in his dark eyes that suggested intelligence beyond his weeks. When Grey Wolf Walking took the baby and began singing softly in Blackfoot, Maggie realized she was witnessing the very ceremony that had brought the old man to her door. "These are the blessing songs," Running Bear explained quietly as his father continued the ancient melody. "The songs that welcome a new spirit to our people and help guide the child toward understanding his purpose in life." Maggie watched in fascination as the simple ceremony unfolded. There was nothing elaborate or theatrical about it, just an elderly man holding his grandson and singing words that had been passed down through generations. Yet the reverence with which everyone present listened made it clear that something profound was taking place. When the song ended, Grey Wolf Walking looked directly at Maggie. "This child will grow up in a world very different from the one I knew as a boy. The old ways and the new ways will have to find balance in his lifetime. Perhaps having friends like you in both worlds will help him navigate those challenges." Over the next 2 days, Maggie lived as a guest in the small winter camp, observing daily life among people she had known only through stories and stereotypes. What she discovered challenged many of her assumptions about Native American culture. Camp operated with a complexity and sophistication that was invisible to casual observers. Everyone had specific roles and responsibilities that contributed to the collective welfare, from the hunters who provided meat to the women who processed hides and prepared food to the elders who settled disputes and preserved cultural knowledge. Morning Light proved to be particularly welcoming, despite the demands of caring for a newborn. She spoke some English and seemed genuinely curious about Maggie's life as a single-woman homesteader. Through their conversations, Maggie learned about the challenges facing Blackfoot women in a rapidly changing world. The old ways gave women important roles in tribal governance, Morning Light explained as they worked together preparing a meal. "We owned the teepees, controlled the distribution of food, and had significant influence in choosing leaders. But as our people are forced to deal more with white authorities, some of these traditions are being questioned." "How so?" Maggie asked, genuinely interested. "White officials prefer to deal only with men. They don't understand or respect the authority that women traditionally held in our society. Some of our younger men are beginning to adopt white attitudes about women's proper place." She smiled ruefully. "It is ironic that as we try to adapt to survive, we may lose some of the very things that made our society strong." This conversation led to others about the broader challenges facing the Blackfoot Nation. The buffalo herds that had sustained their way of life for generations were disappearing, hunted to near extinction by white commercial hunters. Traditional hunting grounds were being claimed by settlers or designated as off-limits by government authorities. Young people were being sent to schools where they were forbidden to speak their native language or practice their cultural traditions. "We face a choice," Running Bear told her during one evening's conversation around the central fire. "We can fight to preserve everything exactly as it has always been, and probably be destroyed in the process. or we can find ways to adapt that preserve what is most important, while accepting that some things must change. "And what do you think is most important to preserve?" Maggie asked. "Our values, our sense of responsibility to each other and to the land, our understanding that individual success means nothing if the community suffers." He gestured toward his sleeping son. "Most importantly, we must preserve our identity as a people, even if the external forms of our life have to change." On her final evening in the camp, Grey Wolf Walking took Maggie aside for a private conversation. They walked to a small rise overlooking the valley, where the teepees glowed like warm lanterns in the gathering darkness. "You have seen how we live," he said simply. "What do you think?" "I think your people face challenges that would break a weaker community," Maggie replied honestly. "But I also see strength and wisdom that most white people never recognize or acknowledge." Grey Wolf Walking nodded thoughtfully. "And what of the choice Chief Red Hawk has offered you? Have these days helped you understand what acceptance would mean?" Maggie considered the question carefully before answering. "I understand better what I would be gaining, but I also understand the weight of responsibility that would come with acceptance. If I became a bridge between our peoples, I would need to be worthy of the trust both sides placed in me. Worthiness is not something you possess or lack," Grey Wolf Walking said gently. "It is something you demonstrate through your actions over time. The question is not whether you are worthy now, but whether you are willing to become worthy through service to something larger than yourself." As they prepared for her departure the next morning, the entire camp gathered to see her off. Children who had been shy on her arrival now crowded around Swift Wind, offering small gifts and asking when she would return. Morning Light pressed a beautifully beaded pouch into her hands, while Running Bear offered a practical winter coat lined with rabbit fur. Most significantly, Grey Wolf Walking presented her with a small medicine bundle, similar to but simpler than his own. "This contains items that will mark you as a friend to our people wherever you travel," he explained. "But more importantly, it represents the connection between us that cannot be broken by distance or time." The journey back to her cabin gave Maggie hours to reflect on what she had experienced. The Blackfoot people she had met were neither the noble savages of romantic literature nor the bloodthirsty warriors of frontier horror stories. They were simply human beings dealing with impossible circumstances with as much dignity and wisdom as they could muster. But her visit had also revealed the complexity of what adoption would entail. It wouldn't just be a matter of joining a different community. It would mean becoming a participant in a struggle for cultural survival that had implications far beyond her personal choices. As her cabin came into view in the late afternoon light, Maggie realized that her month of consideration was nearly half over. Soon, Chief Red Hawk would return for her answer, and she would have to choose between the familiar isolation that had defined her life in Montana and an unknown future that offered both belonging and responsibility in equal measure. That night, as she sat by her fire, surrounded by the gifts from Running Bear's camp, Maggie found herself thinking not about what she might gain or lose, but about the kind of person she wanted to become. The scared young woman who had fled Ohio after a romantic betrayal seemed like a stranger now, someone whose problems and concerns belonged to a different lifetime. The question was no longer whether she was brave enough to accept the Blackfoot offer, but whether she was brave enough to refuse it and remain forever wondering what might have been. March 15th arrived with an unseasonable warmth that sent streams of meltwater cascading from the cabin's roof and transformed the pristine snow into a patchwork of muddy brown and brilliant white. Maggie stood at her window, watching the landscape change, knowing that Chief Red Hawk would return within days to hear her decision. The month he had granted her was nearly over, and she still felt torn between two futures that seemed equally compelling and equally terrifying. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her morning contemplations, but these weren't the measured hoofbeats of Blackfoot riders. The rhythm was urgent, chaotic, carrying an undertone of desperation that immediately put her on alert. Maggie grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, peering through the glass at a sight that made her blood run cold. A cavalry patrol was approaching at full gallop, their blue uniforms stark against the muddy snow. But these weren't the orderly formations she had occasionally seen passing through the territory. These men rode with the frantic urgency of soldiers in retreat, their horses lathered and steaming, several of the riders clearly wounded and clinging to their saddles with obvious difficulty. The patrol consisted of perhaps a dozen men led by a young officer whose uniform bore the insignia of a second lieutenant. As they drew closer, Maggie could see that several had blood-stained bandages, and their equipment showed signs of recent combat. Whatever had happened to them, it had been violent and costly. The lieutenant raised his hand as they approached the cabin, bringing his exhausted patrol to a halt. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice hoarse with fatigue and stress. "I'm Lieutenant William Hayes, 2nd Cavalry. We need shelter and medical assistance for our wounded." Maggie hesitated, her mind racing through the implications. Offering aid to wounded soldiers was the decent thing to do, but their presence at her cabin would certainly be observed by the Blackfoot scouts she now knew were watching the area. How would Chief Red Hawk interpret her decision to help cavalry troops, especially if those troops had been fighting against Native Americans? But looking at the wounded men, some barely conscious in their saddles, her humanitarian instincts overrode political considerations. "Bring them inside," she called back. "I'll do what I can." The next hour was a blur of activity as Maggie transformed her small cabin into a makeshift field hospital. Lieutenant Hayes proved to be a capable assistant, helping to carry the most severely wounded men inside, while she gathered what medical supplies she possessed. Her experience helping at the Cedar Falls Clinic during harsh winters had taught her basic wound care, though nothing had prepared her for injuries this severe. The worst case was a young private named Collins who had taken an arrow through his shoulder, the barbed point still embedded in the muscle. 2 others had bullet wounds that needed cleaning and bandaging, while several more suffered from exhaustion and minor cuts that spoke of a running fight through difficult terrain. "What happened to you?" Maggie asked as she worked to clean Collins's wound, trying to assess whether she could safely remove the arrow without causing more damage. Lieutenant Hayes's face was grim as he helped hold the delirious private still. "We were escorting a supply wagon to Fort Shaw when we were ambushed by a war party, 50, maybe 60 warriors, well organized and well armed. They hit us in a narrow canyon where we couldn't maneuver properly." "Did you identify which tribe?" Maggie asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Blackfoot, from their war paint and tactics, led by a chief wearing an elaborate headdress." Hayes winced as Collins cried out during Maggie's examination of his wound. "We managed to fight our way out, but they killed half my men and captured all our supplies. We've been running for 2 days straight trying to reach the fort." Maggie's heart sank. If Chief Red Hawk's people were actively fighting the cavalry, her position as someone under their protection would become untenable the moment these soldiers reported her presence. Worse, if Hayes realized she had connections to the Blackfoot, he might view her as a collaborator or spy. "The arrow needs to come out," she told Hayes, focusing on the immediate medical crisis while her mind churned with larger implications. "But I'll need help holding him still, and it's going to be extremely painful." For the next several hours, Maggie worked steadily on the wounded soldiers, drawing on every scrap of medical knowledge she possessed. The arrow in Collins's shoulder proved to be the most challenging case. The barbed head had penetrated deeply, and removing it required careful maneuvering to avoid severing major blood vessels. Lieutenant Hayes proved to be more than just a capable assistant. He was an intelligent and observant young man who clearly recognized that Maggie's medical skills went far beyond what he might expect from an isolated homesteader. As she worked, he asked careful questions about her background and circumstances that she deflected as diplomatically as possible. "You handle these wounds like someone with real training," he observed, as she finished bandaging the last of the wounded. "Most frontier women wouldn't know how to remove an arrowhead without killing the patient. I've helped out at the clinic in Cedar Falls during bad winters," Maggie replied truthfully, though she omitted the more relevant experience she had gained during her visit to Running Bear's camp. "You learn quickly when people's lives depend on it." As evening approached, the immediate medical crisis had stabilized. Collins was unconscious, but breathing steadily, his fever beginning to break. The other wounded men were resting as comfortably as the cramped quarters allowed, but Maggie knew that their respite was temporary. By morning, Hayes would want to continue toward Fort Shaw, and he would certainly report her presence and location to his superiors. The dilemma she faced was more complex than simple loyalty to one side or another. These were wounded men who had needed help, and she couldn't regret providing it. But their presence had effectively forced her to choose sides in a conflict she had hoped to avoid entirely. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the cabin door, so quiet that none of the soldiers inside seemed to notice it. Maggie's blood froze as she recognized the pattern. 3 soft taps, a pause, then 2 more. It was a signal Little Wolf had taught her during one of his patrol visits, a way for Blackfoot scouts to identify themselves without alerting potential enemies. Moving as casually as possible, Maggie stepped outside, ostensibly to check on Swift Wind, but actually to respond to the signal. In the gathering darkness near the tree line, she could just make out a familiar silhouette. Little Wolf stood motionless beside a large pine, his presence nearly invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for him. Maggie walked toward the corral, moving close enough to the trees for quiet conversation, without appearing to be talking to anyone. "There are wounded cavalry soldiers in my cabin," she whispered, without looking in Little Wolf's direction. "They say they were attacked by a Blackfoot war party 2 days ago." "We know," came the almost inaudible reply. "Chief, Red Hawk sent me to warn you. Captain Stormcloud led a raid against a supply wagon that was carrying weapons intended for use against our people. The soldiers fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. Lieutenant Hayes says half his men were killed." The lieutenant speaks the truth, but he does not know that Chief Red Hawk ordered his warriors to let the survivors escape rather than killing them all. It was a gesture of respect for their courage. This information did nothing to resolve Maggie's dilemma. If anything, it made her situation more complicated. The Blackfoot had shown restraint, but they had still attacked federal troops. Her decision to help the wounded soldiers would be seen by some as choosing a side in the escalating conflict. "What does Chief Red Hawk expect me to do?" she asked quietly. "He expects you to follow your conscience, as you did when you saved Gray." "Wolf-walking's life," Little Wolf replied, "but he also expects you to understand that your choices will have consequences. The soldiers in your cabin will report your location and circumstances to their commanders. Soon, this place will no longer be safe for someone under Blackfoot protection." The implications were clear. By helping the wounded cavalrymen, Maggie had effectively ended her ability to remain neutral in the growing conflict between the Blackfoot Nation and white authorities. She would have to choose not just between cultures, but between opposing sides in what was becoming an undeclared war. "Chief Red Hawk will come for your answer tomorrow night," Little Wolf continued. "But circumstances have changed. The choice he offered you a month ago may no longer be possible. You may have to choose between immediate safety with his protection or remaining here and facing whatever consequences come from harboring wounded soldiers. After Little Wolf melted back into the forest, Maggie returned to the cabin where Lieutenant Hayes was checking on his men. The young officer looked up as she entered, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer. How long have you been living out here alone?" "About 18 months, Maggie replied truthfully, "and in all that time, you've had no trouble with hostile Indians." The question was asked casually, but Maggie sensed that Hayes suspected more than he was revealing. "I've been fortunate," she said carefully. "This area has been relatively peaceful." Hayes nodded slowly, but his eyes remained skeptical. "It's just unusual, you understand. A woman living alone this far from any settlement, in territory where we've had increasing reports of Indian activity. Most folks would have sought the protection of a fort or at least moved closer to other settlers." "I value my independence," Maggie said, falling back on the explanation she had used with other visitors, "and I've always been careful to avoid trouble." "I'm sure you have." Hayes's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation. "Still, after what happened to my patrol, I have to recommend that you consider relocating somewhere safer. The situation with the Blackfoot is deteriorating rapidly, and isolated homesteads are becoming increasingly dangerous." That night, as the wounded soldiers slept fitfully around her cabin, Maggie lay awake, wrestling with impossible choices. She had perhaps 24 hours before Chief Redhawk arrived to hear her decision about adoption into his tribe. But that decision was now complicated by the presence of federal troops, who would certainly report her circumstances to their superiors. If she chose to go with Chief Redhawk, she would be abandoning her homestead and effectively declaring herself an enemy of the United States government. If she chose to remain, she would be rejecting the protection and belonging that the Blackfoot had offered, leaving herself vulnerable to both government suspicion and potential retaliation from hostile tribes. The next day brought new complications. Private Collins's fever broke completely, and he regained consciousness long enough to describe the Blackfoot ambush in detail. His account painted Chief Redhawk's warriors as skilled and disciplined fighters who had shown unusual restraint in allowing survivors to escape, a detail that seemed to confirm Little Wolf's version of events. But Collins also mentioned seeing a white woman on horseback observing the battle from a distant ridge. "She was too far away for me to see clearly," he told Lieutenant Hayes, "but she looked like she might have been with the Indian party. Could have been a captive, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Hayes glanced meaningfully at Maggie, who was changing the bandage on Collins's shoulder. The coincidence of a white woman being spotted with Blackfoot warriors, combined with Maggie's unusual medical skills and her isolated location in hostile territory, was apparently too significant for the lieutenant to ignore. "Miss Thompson," Hayes said carefully, "I wonder if you might have encountered any other white settlers in the area recently. Anyone who might have had contact with the local tribes?" "I keep to myself," Maggie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I rarely see anyone except for the occasional supply run to Cedar Falls." Hayes nodded, but she could see him making mental notes about her responses. When his patrol was ready to move out, he would certainly report his suspicions, along with everything else that had happened. That afternoon, as the soldiers prepared to depart for Fort Shaw, Hayes approached Maggie one final time. "Miss Thompson, I want to thank you for your assistance with my wounded men. Your medical care probably saved Private Collins's life." "I'm glad I could help," Maggie replied sincerely. "But I also want to give you some advice," Hayes continued, his tone becoming more serious. "The situation in this territory is changing rapidly. The Blackfoot are becoming increasingly organized and aggressive in their resistance to white settlement. Any civilians who are seen as sympathetic to their cause or who provide aid and comfort to their warriors will be viewed as enemies by military authorities. The warning was delivered diplomatically, but its meaning was unmistakable. Hayes suspected her of having connections to the Blackfoot, and he was advising her that such connections would soon become a dangerous liability. "I understand," Maggie said quietly. "I hope you do," Hayes replied, "because the next patrol that comes through here might not be as interested in your medical skills as they are in your answers to questions about where your loyalties lie." As the cavalry patrol disappeared toward the eastern horizon, Maggie knew that her time for careful neutrality had ended. Lieutenant Hayes would reach Fort Shaw within 2 days and file his report about the ambush, his casualties, and the mysterious woman who had provided medical aid. With suspiciously professional skill, military investigators would eventually come to question her more thoroughly, and her connections to the Blackfoot would become impossible to hide. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and gold, Maggie heard the approach of horses once again. But this time, the riders moved with the ceremonial precision she had learned to associate with Chief Red Hawk's formal delegations. The month of consideration was over, and the time for decision had arrived. As the Blackfoot delegation came into view, Maggie realized that her choice had been made not through careful deliberation, but through circumstances that had forced her, and she could no longer remain safely neutral between two peoples increasingly committed to conflict. She would have to choose a side, knowing that either choice would mark her as an enemy to the other. Standing in her doorway as Chief Red Hawk approached, Maggie understood that this night would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of relations between two peoples who seemed destined for war. The simple act of kindness that had started this journey, saving an elderly man's life during a blizzard, had led to consequences she could never have imagined. Chief Red Hawk rode at the head of a larger delegation than before, perhaps 20. Warriors in full ceremonial dress. Their presence was both magnificent and ominous, a display of power that served multiple purposes. To Maggie, they represented the culmination of a month-long decision process. To any military observers who might be watching from a distance, they represented a clear statement about where the Blackfoot Nation's loyalties lay. As the delegation drew closer, Maggie could see that Chief Red Hawk's expression was more solemn than during their previous meeting. The events of the past few days, the ambush, the wounded soldiers, the growing military tension, had clearly affected his assessment of the situation. This was no longer just about honoring a debt to someone who had helped an elder. It was about choosing allies in a conflict that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Maggie Thompson," Chief Red Hawk called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the formal tone of official business. "We have come for your answer, though we understand that circumstances have changed since our last meeting." "They have," Maggie confirmed, stepping forward to meet him. "I provided medical care to wounded cavalry soldiers yesterday. They've continued on to Fort Shaw, where they'll report my presence and capabilities to their commanders." Chief Red Hawk nodded grimly. "Little Wolf informed me of this development. You chose to help wounded enemies of our people, knowing that doing so would compromise your position with us. This was either very foolish or very brave. It was human," Maggie replied simply. "I couldn't watch men suffer when I had the ability to help them, regardless of the politics involved. And this choice tells us much about your character, Chief," Red Hawk said, though his tone made it unclear whether he viewed her decision positively or negatively. "But it also means that the options I offered you a month ago are no longer available. You cannot remain here under our protection while also being investigated by military authorities as a potential collaborator with hostile tribes." The stark reality of her situation crystallized in that moment. By helping the wounded soldiers, she had inadvertently burned the bridge that might have allowed her to remain in the comfortable middle ground between two cultures. Now she would have to choose definitively, knowing that either choice carried enormous risks. "What options do I have now?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Two paths remain open to you," Chief Redhawk replied. "You can come with us tonight, accepting full adoption into our tribe and the protection that comes with it. But you must understand that doing so will mark you as an enemy of the United States government. There will be no going back to your former life. And the other option, you remain here and face whatever consequences come from your association with us. Military investigators will arrive within days, and they will demand answers about your connections to our people. If you cannot satisfy them that you are loyal to their cause, your situation will become very dangerous very quickly." The weight of this ultimatum settled on Maggie's shoulders like a physical burden. She had spent a month agonizing over a philosophical choice between cultures, only to discover that circumstances had transformed it into a matter of immediate survival. There was no more time for careful consideration or gradual transition. "There is something else you must know," Chief Redhawk continued, his expression growing even more grave. "The attack on Lieutenant Hayes's patrol was not an isolated incident. Our scouts report that a large military force is being assembled at Fort Shaw, 3 companies of cavalry, along with artillery and supply wagons. They are preparing for a major campaign against our people." This news sent a chill through Maggie that had nothing to do with the evening air. A force of that size meant the government was preparing for war, not just punitive raids or show-of-force operations. The conflict she had hoped to avoid was about to engulf the entire territory. "When?" she asked. "Within 2 weeks, perhaps sooner. They wait only for reinforcements from Fort Benton and favorable weather for moving artillery." Chief Redhawk's dark eyes held hers steadily. "This information comes from sources we trust completely. The time for peaceful coexistence is ending, whether we wish it or not." As if summoned by the gravity of the conversation, Grey Wolf Walking emerged from among the assembled warriors. The elderly man moved with the dignity Maggie remembered, but there was a sadness in his bearing that spoke to the weight of recent events. "Maggie Thompson," he said, approaching with the measured pace of someone delivering important words. "I am the one who created this situation by asking my nephew to honor the debt owed to you. Now I must ask you to understand what that debt truly means." "I think I'm beginning to understand," Maggie replied quietly. "No, I do not think you do," Grey Wolf Walking said gently. "The debt is not simply about saving one old man's life. It is about preserving the possibility that our peoples might someday find a way to live in peace, rather than destroying each other through fear and misunderstanding." He gestured toward the assembled warriors, then toward the distant lights of what might have been military camps on the horizon. "Both sides prepare for war because both sides believe war is inevitable. But you have shown that understanding is possible, that people from different worlds can treat each other with respect and kindness. This makes you valuable beyond measure." "I'm just one person," Maggie protested. "I can't prevent a war between entire peoples. One person who truly understands both sides might be the only thing that can prevent such a war," Grey Wolf Walking replied. "Or if war cannot be prevented, one person who understands both sides might be essential to finding peace when the fighting ends." The enormity of what he was suggesting left Maggie momentarily speechless. He wasn't just talking about her personal choice between cultures. He was suggesting that her decision might have implications for the future relationship between the Blackfoot Nation and the United States government. "That's an incredible responsibility," she said finally. "Yes, it is," Chief Redhawk confirmed. and it is not one we would ask you to bear if we did not believe you were capable of carrying it. But the choice must be yours alone, made with full knowledge of what it entails. As the three of them stood in the gathering darkness, surrounded by warriors whose faces reflected the firelight from torches, Maggie found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Montana seeking nothing more than escape from personal disappointment and social scandal. She had built her cabin in this isolated location, hoping to avoid exactly the kind of complex human entanglements that now surrounded her. But perhaps that had been the wrong approach all along. Perhaps the answer to betrayal and disappointment wasn't isolation, but finding people and causes worthy of trust and commitment. Perhaps the strength she had thought came from needing no one actually came from being needed by others. "If I choose to come with you," she said slowly, "what would be expected of me?" "Initially, simply to survive and learn," Chief Redhawk replied. "Our people would need time to accept a white woman as a member of the tribe, and you would need time to truly understand our ways. But eventually, if war comes, you might serve as an interpreter and negotiator, helping each side understand what the other really wants. And if I choose to stay, then you face interrogation by military investigators who will assume you are a spy or collaborator. If you cannot convince them otherwise, you will likely be arrested and imprisoned. If you can convince them, you might be forced to provide information about our movements and plans." The choice, when stripped of all its complications, was brutally simple. Accept adoption into the Blackfoot tribe and become an enemy of her own government, or remain and face persecution as a suspected traitor. There was no neutral ground left, no way to avoid choosing sides in a conflict that neither side seemed to want, but both sides seemed unable to prevent. As Maggie stood in the doorway of the cabin she had built with her own hands, looking out at the landscape that had become her refuge and the people who had become her unexpected family, she realized that the ultimate test of her character wasn't about courage or wisdom or loyalty to abstract principles. It was about whether she was willing to risk everything, her safety, her identity, her future, for the possibility that understanding between peoples was worth more than the comfort of remaining safely on the sidelines while others fought and died. The ultimate test of her character was about to begin. Maggie stood in the doorway of her cabin, feeling the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. The torchlight flickered across the faces of the assembled Blackfoot warriors, each one waiting patiently for her decision. Behind her lay 18 months of careful isolation, the life she had built from nothing in the Montana wilderness. Before her lay an unknown future that could reshape the relationship between two peoples balanced on the edge of war. "I need a moment," she said quietly, and without waiting for permission she turned and walked back into her cabin. Inside the small space that had been her refuge and sanctuary, Maggie looked around at the life she was about to abandon. The table Thomas had crafted with such care during those hopeful early days, the bed where she had slept alone for so many nights, dreaming of a future that now seemed impossibly naive, the books she had brought from Ohio, filled with poetry and philosophy that had sustained her through the loneliest hours. But as she moved through the familiar space, touching objects that had once defined her identity, Maggie realized that somewhere along the way, these things had stopped being enough. The woman who had fled Ohio after a romantic betrayal would have clung to this isolated safety, but she was no longer that woman. She had become someone who opened her door to dying strangers, who risked her life to save others, who chose compassion over caution, even when the consequences were uncertain. Moving quickly now, she gathered the few possessions that truly mattered, her medical supplies, which might prove valuable in her new life, the journal where she had recorded her thoughts and experiences, a record of her transformation from Margaret Worthington to Maggie Thompson to whatever she would become next. The small medicine bundle Grey Wolf Walking had given her, already marking her as a friend to the Blackfoot people. Everything else, the furniture, the books, the carefully accumulated household goods, would remain as a monument to the life she was choosing to leave behind. Perhaps someday someone else would find this cabin and make use of what she couldn't carry. Perhaps it would simply stand empty, slowly returning to the wilderness that had always surrounded it. When she emerged from the cabin carrying a single pack, the assembled delegation remained exactly as she had left them, showing the patience and respect that had marked all her interactions with Grey Wolf Walking's people. Chief Redhawk stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral, as he waited for her announcement. "I accept your offer of adoption," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was committing to. "But I want you to understand that I'm not choosing sides in a war. I'm choosing to stand with people who value honor and compassion, regardless of their race or culture." Chief Redhawk nodded solemnly. "That is the answer we hope to hear, but it is also the answer that will demand the most from you. Are you prepared for what comes next?" "No," Maggie replied honestly, "but I don't think anyone can be prepared for something like this. We'll all have to learn as we go." The formal adoption ceremony took place that very night, under a full moon that bathed the snow-covered landscape in silver light. Grey Wolf Walking served as the primary officiant, speaking ancient words in Blackfoot, while Chief Redhawk and the assembled warriors bore witness. Maggie understood little of the specific language, but the gravity and reverence of the ritual was unmistakable. When it was over, she was no longer Maggie Thompson, homesteader. She was a brave heart woman, daughter of the Blackfoot Nation, bound by sacred obligations to defend her new people as they would defend her. The name felt strange on her tongue, but she sensed the honor inherent in it. Among these people, courage was the highest virtue, and they had chosen to acknowledge hers in the most public way possible. The journey to the main winter camp took 2 days, traveling through a country that was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly unforgiving. Maggie rode swift wind alongside warriors who had initially viewed her with curiosity and suspicion, but who gradually began to include her in their conversations and observations about the landscape they were crossing. She was surprised to discover that many of them spoke at least some English, learned through trading relationships or encounters with missionaries and government officials. Their perspective on recent events was markedly different from what she had heard from Lieutenant Hayes and his men. "The soldiers talk about protecting settlers from savage Indians," explained a young warrior named Spotted Eagle, as they paused to rest the horses beside a frozen stream. "But they do not speak of the treaties they have broken, the sacred sites they have desecrated, the children they have stolen and sent to schools where they are forbidden to speak our language." "Both sides have grievances," Maggie observed carefully. "Both sides have suffered losses." "Yes, but only one side has the power to end the cycle of violence," replied an older warrior called Bear Claw. "We fight because we have been pushed into smaller and smaller territories, because our way of life is being systematically destroyed. Your people fight because they want our remaining lands and resources." These conversations gave Maggie insights into the Blackfoot perspective that she had never encountered in the settlements or newspapers. She began to understand that what white authorities characterized as unprovoked Indian aggression was often retaliation for previous attacks or responses to treaty violations that never made it into official reports. The main winter camp was far, larger than Running Bear's small settlement, a sprawling community of nearly 300 people arranged in careful patterns that reflected complex social and family relationships. Maggie's arrival caused a sensation, with curious crowds gathering to observe the white woman who had been formally adopted into the tribe. The first weeks of her new life were challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. Learning to navigate the social protocols of Blackfoot society required constant attention and frequent correction from more experienced tribal members. The language barrier made simple communications difficult, and she found herself exhausted by the mental effort required to understand and be understood. But she also discovered unexpected sources of support and friendship. Morning Light had traveled from Running Bear's camp specifically to help with Maggie's transition, bringing the baby and serving as both translator and cultural guide. Other women, initially skeptical of the outsider who had been granted such unusual status, gradually warmed to her when they saw her willingness to learn and contribute. Maggie's medical knowledge proved invaluable almost immediately. An outbreak of respiratory illness in the camp would have been devastating without proper treatment, but her understanding of hygiene and basic medicine helped contain the spread, while her herbal remedies, learned from a combination of her own research and instruction from Blackfoot healers, eased the suffering of those already afflicted. It was during this medical crisis that she first encountered White Elk, the tribe's primary medicine man, and one of Chief Redhawk's most trusted advisors. Initially suspicious of her methods and motives, he gradually came to respect her knowledge and dedication to healing, eventually inviting her to observe and participate in traditional ceremonies that were normally closed to outsiders. "You see, sickness as an enemy to be fought," White Elk explained during one of their collaborations. "We see it as a sign of imbalance that must be corrected. Both approaches have value, and perhaps together they are stronger than either alone." This philosophy of synthesis, combining the best of both worlds rather than choosing one over the other, became a recurring theme in Maggie's adaptation to Blackfoot life. She learned to prepare traditional foods while contributing her own cooking techniques. She adopted traditional clothing while maintaining some elements of her former dress that proved practical in the harsh climate. Most importantly, she began to develop a unique perspective that allowed her to understand conflicts from multiple viewpoints simultaneously. This skill proved crucial when, 3 weeks after her adoption, scouts brought word that the anticipated military campaign was beginning. 3 companies of cavalry, along with artillery and supply wagons, had departed Fort Shaw and were moving toward known Blackfoot winter camps. The time for preparation was over. The time for conflict had arrived. Chief Redhawk called a council of war, bringing together the band's most experienced warriors and strategists to plan their response to the approaching threat. To Maggie's surprise, she was invited to participate, not as a military advisor, but as someone who might understand the enemy's motivations and intentions better than those who had never lived among white people. "The soldiers will expect us to fight in the traditional way," Chief Redhawk explained as the council gathered around a large fire in the ceremonial lodge. "They have studied our previous tactics and developed strategies to counter them, but they do not expect us to understand their tactics as well as we do." "What do you mean?" asked Captain Stormcloud, the war leader who had led the successful raid against Lieutenant Hayes's patrol. "Brave Heart Woman has lived among the whites for most of her life," Chief Redhawk replied, using Maggie's new name with the careful respect accorded to all tribal members. "She understands how they think, how they make decisions, what they fear most. This knowledge might help us avoid unnecessary battles while winning the necessary ones." For the next several hours, Maggie found herself in the surreal position of helping plan military strategy against forces that included people she had once considered her own countrymen. But as she listened to the discussion, she realized that the Blackfoot leaders were not seeking total war or maximum destruction. They were looking for ways to defend their people while leaving open the possibility of eventual negotiation and peace. "The soldiers will expect us to attack their supply lines," she observed during one discussion of tactics. "They've positioned guards specifically to defend against raids on their ammunition and food wagons. But they probably haven't anticipated that you might try to capture rather than destroy those supplies." "To what purpose?" asked Stormcloud. "Captured supplies can be returned as part of peace negotiations," Maggie explained. "But destroyed supplies only escalate the conflict. If your goal is to demonstrate strength while keeping open the possibility of talks, capturing might serve you better than destroying." This perspective, thinking beyond immediate military objectives to long-term political goals, proved influential in shaping the tribe's response to the approaching campaign. Rather than simply fighting to inflict maximum damage, they began planning operations designed to demonstrate their capability while creating opportunities for eventual dialogue. The strategy was put to the test 5 days later when Army scouts located the winter camp and the anticipated attack began. But instead of the overwhelming assault the military commanders had planned, they found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move, that struck precisely where they were weakest while avoiding direct confrontation where they were strongest. Maggie watched the first engagement from a concealed position on a ridge overlooking the valley, serving as an observer and messenger rather than a combatant. What she saw confirmed her growing understanding that this conflict was fundamentally different from the Indian wars she had read about in Eastern newspapers. Both sides fought with professional competence and considerable restraint. The Blackfoot warriors used superior knowledge of the terrain to harass and confuse the attacking forces without inflicting catastrophic casualties. The cavalry officers, recognizing that they were dealing with skilled opponents rather than untrained raiders, adjusted their tactics accordingly while maintaining strict discipline among their troops. When the day's fighting ended without decisive victory for either side, both forces withdrew to defensive positions and began the careful process of assessing what had been learned. It was during this lull that Maggie found herself facing the role she had been unconsciously preparing for since her adoption, serving as a bridge between two worlds that were struggling to understand each other. The opportunity came sooner than anyone had expected. On the second day of the standoff, a white flag appeared above the cavalry positions, followed by a small party of officers riding slowly toward the Blackfoot lines. Chief Redhawk responded with his own delegation, and for the first time since hostilities began, representatives of both sides met under a temporary truce. "They want to talk," Chief Redhawk reported when he returned from the brief meeting. "Their commanding officer is Colonel Marcus Webb, a professional soldier who prefers negotiation to unnecessary bloodshed. He's requested a formal parley to discuss terms." "What kind of terms?" Maggie asked. "That remains to be seen, but he specifically asked if we had anyone who could serve as an interpreter, someone who truly understands both sides." Chief Red Hawk looked directly at her. "I believe this is why you were brought to us, brave heart woman, not just to be saved from your former life, but to serve as a voice for understanding when the time came." The prospect of mediating between two forces that had been shooting at each other just hours earlier was both terrifying and exhilarating. Everything that had happened since that February blizzard, saving Grey Wolf Walking's life, accepting Blackfoot protection, learning their language and customs, witnessing their perspective on the conflict, had been preparing her for this moment. "What do you want me to accomplish?" she asked. "Help them understand that we are not savage enemies to be destroyed, but people defending our families and our way of life," Chief Redhawk replied. "Help us understand that they are not all monsters bent on our extermination, but soldiers following orders in a situation they may not fully comprehend. Find the common ground that might allow both sides to step back from total war." 2 days later, Maggie found herself sitting in a canvas tent between Colonel Webb and Chief Red Hawk, serving as both translator and cultural interpreter in negotiations that would determine whether the Montana Territory descended into prolonged warfare or found a path toward coexistence. The talks were difficult, marked by centuries of mistrust and misunderstanding. But slowly, patiently, Maggie helped each side understand what the other truly wanted and feared. The Blackfoot wanted security for their families and respect for their culture. The military wanted stability in the territory and protection for white settlers. Neither side wanted endless war, but both had been convinced that war was the only option available. Through 3 days of careful negotiation, mediated by a woman who had learned to see the world through multiple sets of eyes, a preliminary agreement began to take shape. It wasn't a permanent solution that would require involvement from Washington and formal treaty negotiations, but it was a framework for stepping back from immediate conflict while more comprehensive discussions took place. When the agreement was signed, witnessed by warriors and soldiers who had been enemies just days earlier, Maggie realized that her journey from an isolated homestead to the center of historical events was complete. She had found her purpose not in avoiding the complexities of human relationships, but in embracing them fully. The scared young woman who had fled Ohio after a romantic betrayal had become someone who could build bridges between entire peoples. The homesteader who had valued isolation above all else had discovered that her greatest strength lay in connection and understanding. As spring came to the Montana Territory and the snow began to melt from the mountains, revealing the green promise of new growth beneath, Maggie looked toward a future that held more uncertainty than security, more challenges than comfort, but also more meaning than she had ever dared hope for. She had fed a starving elder during a blizzard, and in return, she had discovered who she was meant to become. The debt had been repaid in ways neither of them could have imagined, creating ripples of understanding that might someday help two peoples learn to share the same land in peace. But even as the immediate crisis passed and the framework for peace took shape, Maggie understood that her real work was just beginning. The preliminary agreement she had helped negotiate was only a first step toward the kind of lasting understanding that could prevent future conflicts. Building trust between peoples who had been enemies for generations would require patience, wisdom, and the kind of sustained effort that measured success in decades rather than days. 1 month after the peace talks concluded, a new challenge emerged that would test everything she had learned about bridging different worlds. A delegation of officials from Washington arrived in the territory, sent by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to investigate reports of an unauthorized treaty negotiated by a rogue colonel and witnessed by a white woman who had allegedly gone native. The delegation was led by Assistant Commissioner Harrison Blackwood, a name that sent a chill through Maggie when she heard it. Richard Blackwood's younger brother, a man who had built his career on implementing the government's most aggressive policies toward Native American tribes. If Harrison had come to Montana, it meant that powerful forces in Washington viewed the peace agreement as a dangerous precedent that needed to be overturned. "They want to interrogate you," Chief Red Hawk informed her as scouts brought word of the delegation's approach. "Harrison Blackwood has been telling officials in Washington that you are either a traitor who has betrayed your own people or a deluded woman who has been manipulated by hostile savages. Either way, he intends to use your case to justify voiding our agreement and resuming military operations." The irony was bitter. The man whose brother had betrayed her trust and driven her from Ohio was now in a position to destroy everything she had worked to build in Montana. But Maggie had learned too much about herself and her capabilities to be intimidated by ghosts from her past. "Let him come," she said quietly. I'm not the same woman who fled from scandal in Ohio. I know who I am now, and I know what I stand for." The confrontation took place 3 days later in the same tent where she had helped negotiate the peace agreement. Harrison Blackwood was older than his brother, but carried the same arrogant assumption of superiority that had made Richard so destructive. His opening words revealed that he knew exactly who she was and intended to use that knowledge as a weapon. "Miss Margaret Worthington," he said, deliberately using her former name. "Or do you prefer your current Indian appellation? I must say, your family in Ohio was quite shocked to learn of your transformation." "My name is Brave Heart Woman," Maggie replied calmly. "I was legally adopted into the Blackfoot Nation according to their customs and traditions. What my former family thinks of my choices is irrelevant to these proceedings." "Is it, though?" Blackwood smiled coldly. "Because I have here sworn statements from citizens of Columbus, Ohio, describing your emotional instability following a broken engagement, your bizarre fixation on matters beyond a woman's proper sphere of concern, and your family's conviction that you suffered a complete mental breakdown before disappearing." Colonel Webb, who had been observing silently, spoke up for the first time. "Commissioner Blackwood, Miss Thompson's, excuse me, Brave Heartwoman's mental faculties were quite evident during our negotiations. Her insights and mediation were crucial to achieving a peaceful resolution." "Ah, yes, Colonel Webb." Blackwood turned his attention to the military officer. "Another matter we need to discuss. You exceeded your authority by entering into negotiations with hostile tribes, and you relied on the advice of a woman whose loyalty to the United States is, at best, questionable." "My loyalty is to preventing unnecessary bloodshed and finding solutions that serve everyone's interests," Maggie interjected. "If that makes me disloyal in your eyes, then perhaps your definition of loyalty needs examination." The interrogation continued for hours, with Blackwood attempting to paint her as either mentally unstable or treasonous, while she calmly explained her journey from isolated homesteader to cultural mediator. Chief Redhawk and Colonel Webb both testified to her contributions to the peace process, but Blackwood dismissed their statements as either biased or naive. Finally, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the canvas walls, Maggie decided to take a different approach. Instead of defending herself against Blackwood's accusations, she went on the offensive. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "you've spent considerable time questioning my loyalty and mental stability, but you haven't asked a single question about the actual terms of the agreement we negotiated, or why both military and Blackfoot leaders consider it preferable to continued warfare. Doesn't that suggest that your real concern isn't the welfare of American citizens, but the preservation of policies that have failed repeatedly?" "The policies of the United States government toward Indian tribes are not subject to debate by whom?" Maggie interrupted. "By women? By people who have actually lived among the tribes you're so eager to destroy? By anyone who might have insights that contradict your predetermined conclusions?" The tent fell silent as the implications of her challenge sank in. She had just accused a federal official of closed-mindedness and administrative incompetence in front of multiple witnesses. "You have no standing to question government policy," Blackwood said, his voice tight with anger. "You are a citizen who has abandoned her own people to live among enemies of the United States." "No," Maggie replied firmly. "I am a citizen who has learned that the people you call enemies are actually human beings, with legitimate grievances and reasonable demands. I am someone who has discovered that most conflicts arise from misunderstanding rather than genuine incompatibility of interests." She stood up, drawing herself to her full height and looking directly into Blackwood's eyes. "And I am someone who refuses to be intimidated by men who mistake arrogance for authority and prejudice for patriotism." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Grey Wolf Walking chose that moment to enter the tent. The The elderly man's presence changed the entire atmosphere, bringing with it the dignity and authority that had impressed Maggie from their first meeting. "Assistant Commissioner Blackwood," he said in perfect English, "I am Grey Wolf Walking, elder of the Blackfoot Nation, and keeper of our sacred traditions. I understand you question the wisdom of the peace we have negotiated." Blackwood looked startled by the old man's command of English and formal bearing. Whatever he had expected from a savage chief, it clearly wasn't this level of sophistication and dignity. "The United States government does not recognize unauthorized agreements with hostile tribes," Blackwood replied, though his tone was noticeably less aggressive than it had been with Maggie. "Then perhaps," Grey Wolf Walking said quietly, "the United States government should ask itself why its authorized agreements have consistently failed to prevent bloodshed, while our unauthorized agreement has brought peace to this territory for the first time in decades." The simple logic of this observation left Blackwood momentarily speechless. In the silence that followed, Maggie realized that the old man had just delivered the most devastating critique possible. Not an emotional attack or a self-righteous lecture, but a calm statement of demonstrable fact. Over the next several days, as Blackwood's investigation continued, a remarkable thing happened. Word of the confrontation spread throughout the territory, and people began arriving to testify on behalf of the peace agreement. Settlers who had lived in fear of Indian raids spoke about the security they now enjoyed. Soldiers described the relief of not having to plan attacks on families and children. Even some government officials expressed cautious support for policies that actually worked rather than policies that simply sounded tough. When Blackwood finally departed for Washington, his mission to discredit the agreement had clearly failed. The evidence of its success was too overwhelming, and the alternative, returning to warfare that benefited no one, was too obviously destructive. 6 months later, the preliminary agreement was formally ratified as the Treaty of Sweetgrass Hills, establishing the framework for a new relationship between the Blackfoot Nation and the United States government. Maggie found herself appointed as the first official cultural liaison, a position that formalized the role she had been playing since her adoption. As she stood on the ridge overlooking the valley where she had first encountered Grey Wolf Walking, during that February blizzard, Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the scared young woman who had fled Ohio, convinced that isolation was safety. She thought of the homesteader who had built a cabin in the wilderness, hoping to need no one and be needed by no one. Most of all, she thought of the simple choice she had made to open her door to a dying stranger, never imagining that act of basic human kindness would lead to a complete transformation of her understanding of courage, purpose, and belonging. In the end, that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.